Okay, guys, back to our book reading, Gods of the Bible. We just finished up chapter 10, I think it was, yes. Chapter 10, Drug Addicted Gods. That was interesting. And now we're going to start on chapter 11. The name of this chapter is The Messengers of God. So let's get started. In many biblical stories, there are intermediary figures called Malachim, who act and speak on behalf of the Elohim and generally interact with the people of Israel in various capacities. Theological tradition calls these Malachim, angels, and attributes to them, as we shall see in this chapter, a whole set of complicated spiritual characteristics. Angelology is the discipline that studies the transcendental and metaphysical nature of these beings. However, are the spiritual and transcendental features attributed to the Malachim by angelology, religious piety, theologians, and traditional exegetes grounded in the Bible? Literal analysis of Genesis, Exodus, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Tobiah, and Zechariah has led us to conclude that these so-called angels clearly behave like individuals of flesh and blood. The Malachim walk, get dusty, get tired, get upset, need to wash and rest, eat twice in the same day, decide where to spend the night, and protect themselves from attacks with methods that are worthy of our scrutiny. Their physical difference is noticeable. They are endowed with powers superior to those of humans, but still they are not omnipotent. They show vulnerability, can be attacked, and are subject to regular physiological needs of human beings. We will show how the Malachim can often instill fear in those who encounter them, and their presence is hardly ever reassuring. Many of those who meet them fear they may not survive. It will soon be clear that the ethereal, positive, and reassuring angelic figures that religious tradition devised still present today in popular piety have no ground in the Bible. The biblical accounts are also far from later theoretical elaborations that have divided the angels into complicated angelic hierarchies, describing them as mediating entities between human carnality and divine spirituality. For the sake of clarity, we would like to preface that our goal is not to prove the existence of angelic beings or otherwise. We just want to verify their presence and description in the Old Testament and compare our findings with the religious and spiritualistic tradition in general. Angelology speaks of various ranks of angels, distinguished according to the functions performed. Each receives from God unique spiritual gifts, such as light, science, or goodness. Their task is transmitting these spiritual gifts down to humans. Together, these figures form 9 angelic choirs divided into 3 orders. Each order is, in turn, divided into ranks. The highest order is composed of seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. The second order is composed of denominations, virtues, and powers. The third and lowest order is composed of principalities, archangels, and angels. Each group possesses specific characteristics which we do not enumerate here, except those that interest us related to the orders of the angels and cherubim, as they are the subject of our analysis. Among the qualities attributed to angels, it is said, for example, that they are the way to the Word, the perfect vessel of divine light. They convey the power of God In converting sinners, they impart wisdom. In the revelation of the divine mysteries, they correspond justice in the condemnation of the wicked. They are an example worthy of imitation in avoiding punishment, overcoming vices, being admitted to heaven, etc. Given these descriptions, we make a first and immediate observation. We are dealing here with beings whose physical and behavioral characteristics are far less elevating and inspiring than those we have mentioned, apropos of angels and other angelic orders. Therefore, is everything written about angels in theology justified by the description of the Malachim found in the Old Testament? Are we sure that the theological vision is consistent with the events described in the Bible? Okay, the second subtopic is the Malachim in the Old Testament. We now present some situations in which the angels Malachim are involved and leave it to the readers to make their own reflections. Genesis 16. The patriarch Abram and his bride Sarai have no children, despite Yahweh's promise that they will have as many children as there are grains of sand. Time passes without Sarai being able to conceive. Disappointed by the passing of time, Sarai decides to give the Egyptian maid Hagar to her husband Abram. Hagar gets pregnant, becomes arrogant, and takes advantage of her new status until Sarai drives her out of the camp with Abram's permission. The slave girl leaves the camp and wanders in the desert where she meets a Malak. Genesis 16:7. Hebrew to English translation, and found messenger of Yahweh on spring water, the waters in the desert, on the spring water in road of Shur. The encounter with the messenger of Yahweh seems casual, as the angel Malak himself looks surprised. However, he shows that he knows Hagar personally since he asked her. Hebrew to English translation again. Hagar, slave of Sarai, where from this you come, and where will you go? So the messenger knows Hagar, but does not know where she is going or why she is there. As far as he knows, she is supposed to be in Abram's camp, and so he orders her to return there and serve her mistress. He does not fail, however, to reassure her. The son she gives birth to will be the progenitor of a great people. From Ismail descended that group of peoples commonly called nomadic Arabs. The narrative has its epilogue in chapter 21, in which Yahweh makes another decision. Sarai, with the help of God, finally conceives and gives birth to Isaac. Yahweh chooses him to be the true heir and progenitor of the new descendants who will populate the so-called Promised Land. This choice has precise consequences. There cannot be two heirs. Conflict and separation must be avoided. Power and control over property must not be shared. Thus, after the birth of the rightful heir, Hagar must leave the camp forever. But, as we have said, Ismail will still be the progenitor of a great nation. Undoubtedly, every person born from Abraham's lineage must have had an important place in the strategic design of the Elohim who ruled over that part of the Middle East. Over time, Yahweh had to build up a group of people with whom to occupy and rule the territories that had been assigned to him at the time of the division made by Elyon. His messengers acted according to the precise strategic plan. In the story of Hagar, It must be noted, we are faced with a concrete situation, no visions or dreams. When Hagar encounters the Malak, we are confronted with an unanticipated and undoubtedly real and concrete event. The messenger does not fly in. He does not show himself in a vision. He meets the woman in a specific place, addresses her personally, and asks her questions from which it is clear that he was not informed about what was happening. It is an ordinary meeting and dialogue between two real people, individuals. Genesis 22. In Genesis 22, Yahweh demands a particularly burdensome and cruel test of loyalty to Abraham. He forces him to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham agrees. He prepares everything for the sacrifice and sets off for the hill indicated to him. On the way, however, the son is astonished to discover that an essential element is missing, the sacrificial victim. The father cannot reveal to the son that the intended sacrifice is Isaac himself, and reassures him by saying Yahweh will provide the victim for sacrifice. Once they reach their destination, Abraham builds the altar, puts wood on it, binds Isaac, and puts him on the pile. He grabs his knife, and just when he's about to kill his son, Genesis 22:11, Hebrew to English translation, and he called towards him, messenger of Yahweh, from the sky, and said, Abraham, Abraham. A malak calls Abraham from the sky and orders him to stop. He does not need to perform the sacrifice. The loyalty test is passed, and the Elohim now knows he can count on an ally so faithful as to be willing to sacrifice his son's life. The sacrifice continues at the expense of a goat caught on the spot. In this sequence of events, there is precise distinction between two figures, the Elohim, who test Abraham in verse 1, and the Malak, who comes to him from above to interrupt the sacrifice. The whole scene of dialogue with call and response is highly effective in its simplicity. The Malak calls, Abraham, Abraham. Twice he responds, Hineni, here I am here. The conversation continues and ends with renewed promises for the future of Abraham and his descendants. Let us note that the allegedly omniscient God does not know Abraham's disposition towards him in advance, and therefore has to test him with a concrete, cruel, and inhuman request. Only after he makes sure that Abraham obeys him perfectly does God send a malak, a messenger, to interrupt the sacrifice. Had the Elohim been able to read Abraham's mind, this passage would prove to be a string of meaningless actions. But God did not know Abraham's thoughts, so he had to put him to the test. He is no different from ordinary earthly rulers, and as ordinary earthly rulers often prefer to bring in intermediaries, so does he. The narrative thus presents us with an Elohim who cannot grasp a person's state of mind and employs a malak to interrupt an ongoing action. As anyone can verify by reading this biblical story, any spiritual connotation is absent from both the premise and the sequence of the events. Genesis 28. We encourage our reader to consult directly the biblical passage in which Jacob describes seeing a ladder connecting earth and heaven with angels ascending and descending on it. This scene is often read in ufological perspective. We fundamentally agree with this interpretation, but want to respect the biblical text, which explicitly states that Jacob was asleep. It was all a dream. Since it is not our task to interpret dreams, we withhold judgment on this scene. The reader, however, will do well to form his own opinion by consulting any version of the Bible directly. Genesis 32. In the previous section, we witnessed actions that would be described as typical of the Malachim. They acted as mediators, spokesmen, and executors of orders. Now we will see a situation in which the Malachim are present but do nothing. It is precisely their inaction that makes the situation interesting. This incident is so insignificant that it is always forgotten by commentators interested in the extraordinary. Experience teaches us, however, that indirect clues of great significance are often hidden in the folds of the ordinary. Jacob has traveled to the land of his fathers to choose a bride. After a series of tribulations, he acquires more than one and returns to the home of his father Isaac. During his journey, an incident occurs that has nothing to do with the journey itself and has no apparent consequences. The inclusion of this passage in the Bible is not justified in the grand scheme of Jacob's journey and narrative, but it is precisely this fact that makes it interesting for our purposes. Jacob was in the middle of his journey, Hebrew to English translation, and stumbled upon him messengers of Elohim. Jacob exclaims Jacob, Malachim, the seeing on, camp of Elohim, this. As a result of this meeting, he decides to call that place Machamenim, a term that is always translated as if it were a proper name. In reality, Machamenim is the dual form of Makhain, which means camp. Their Machamain means two camps. This a particularly vivid and realistic scene. The angels do nothing. They mind their own business. Jacob arrives with his people and his cattle. The Malachim approach him without speaking. He recognizes them as messengers of the Elohim and realizes that he has come near two of their quarters, and therefore decides to identify this place as Machamenim. The root of the verb paga, to come across, contains within itself the concept of chance, fate, and thus the narrative tells us with a clarity that requires no interpretation that the encounter happened by chance. None of the actors, neither Jacob nor the Malachim, expected it. The presence of the Malachim, Jacob's realization that he found by chance two camps of the Elohim, and the particular construction of the name that Jacob decides to give the place, Machanaim, two camps, confirms the reading of the Hebrew exegete Rashi de Troyes, who openly speaks of two camps of armies defending the two sides of the territorial border. Perhaps it is not by chance that some members of the troop, the Malachim, moved to meet the stranger who was coming closer. Their mere presence induced Jacob and his people not to approach any further and resume their journey home in a different direction. Nothing else happens. The angels do not fly in. There is no messages. No actions are performed. No orders are given or executed, and there are no visions or dreams. The Bible simply reports a casual encounter. Some Malachim approach Jacob without direct contact immediately afterward. Everyone continues with what he is doing before the encounter. Anyone who has seen civilians approaching a military camp out of sheer curiosity knows that the guards would immediately intervene to deny them entry. In many cases, the mere sight of the guards is enough to make it clear that one is not allowed to come close. The same happened to Jacob. If we find the story in the Bible, it is because Jacob was impressed by it. The sight of an Elohim camp must have not been an ordinary event. And so the patriarch fondly recalled the experience. The Malachim did nothing and said nothing to him, but the double camp remained firmly in his memory and in the biblical text. Exodus 23. I'm getting close to, I'm going to stop at 25 minutes. Of particular importance is the content of Exodus 23, verses 20 through 30, which sets forth the strategy that Yahweh intends to employ in conquering the promised land for Moses and his people. An essential component of this strategy entails the presence of a malach, a messenger whom Yahweh will send before Moses and the people to supervise them and give them the necessary instructions. The malach will always go before them, and they are to provide him with absolute obedience. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we will start again on page 206 and continue with this chapter. And this is the chapter about messengers of God. All right, I'll talk to you guys again soon. We'll keep reading.